That night, it wasn't an army. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't even a war. It was a single decision, one choice made in silence, that rippled across nations, shook leaders, and redrew the map of history. A decision so powerful, the world would never be the same again. What makes history truly unforgettable isn't always the bloodshed on battlefields or the roar of missiles in the sky. Sometimes, it is the quiet stroke of a pen, a whispered order, or a single step taken that alters the course of humanity forever. That night was one of those rare turning points. A moment when the future of entire nations, the fate of millions, and the balance of global power hinged on a solitary choice. In the grand halls of power, leaders wrestled with fear and ambition. Outside, ordinary people slept unaware that when they awoke, their world would be different. Borders would shift, alliances would fracture, and futures once certain would collapse into chaos or rise into opportunity. The decision was not loud, but its echoes were thunderous. And yet, what made this night even more extraordinary was not just the change it brought, but the lesson it left behind. That history doesn't wait for armies to march or bombs to fall. Sometimes, history waits for a single human decision, one that can ignite hope or unleash devastation. That night proved that the mightiest force on earth is not the sword or the gun, but the power of choice itself. This was the night destiny changed its course, not through war, but through one decision that forever rewrote the story of our world. The weight of a single choice is often underestimated, yet history has shown us time and again that one decision can carry the power of armies, the reach of empires, and the voice of generations. That night, the decision made was not just political, it was deeply human. A single mind, wrestling with consequences, stood at the crossroads of caution and courage, hesitation and resolve. The outcome of that decision rippled across borders, shifting alliances, and reshaping how nations viewed themselves and each other. In that moment, silence was louder than war. No bombs fell, no armies marched, yet the world trembled. Leaders in faraway capitals stayed awake through the night, their intelligence briefings arriving like thunder, their advisors warning of consequences no one could fully predict. The decision forced them to question their strategies, their alliances, and even their very definition of power. It was as if the ground beneath their feet had shifted without warning, leaving them scrambling for balance. But beyond politics, the human side of the decision carried an even greater weight. Families, economies, and societies were touched without even realizing why. One choice set off a chain of events that altered the hopes and fears of millions. It reminded the world that a single decision, made in one room, can travel farther and faster than any missile ever could. History remembers battles and wars, but it never forgets those defining decisions, the ones that rewrite the script of humanity without a single shot being fired. That night was proof that true power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and in that whisper, destinies are reshaped and the course of history forever altered. The collapse of old alliances didn't happen with explosions or dramatic speeches. It happened with silence, hesitation, and doubt. For decades, the world relied on certain partnerships as unshakable foundations of global order. These were bonds formed through wars, treaties, and shared ambitions. They were supposed to be unbreakable, immune to the storms of politics. But on that night, one decision cracked the pillars of trust that held them together. Leaders who had once stood shoulder to shoulder suddenly questioned one another's motives. Friends became cautious observers, and allies began to calculate whether loyalty still served their interests. The decision sent a message across oceans and deserts alike: nothing is guaranteed. What seemed eternal could collapse in an instant. Governments scrambled to reassess their positions, unsure whether their allies would still stand with them when the next test arrived. Behind closed doors, phone calls carried urgency, voices tense with fear. Some nations felt betrayed, abandoned in their hour of need. Others felt liberated, no longer bound by promises that no longer served them. It was the unraveling of a carefully woven fabric, a slow tearing sound that echoed across continents. And the world realized that alliances, no matter how grand or historic, were only as strong as the trust behind them. The collapse wasn't just political, it was deeply psychological. People who once believed in the safety of belonging to powerful blocs began to feel exposed. The uncertainty spread beyond leaders and diplomats. It seeped into markets, communities, and the very psyche of nations. That night, the lesson was harsh and unforgettable. Alliances built on fear, convenience, or self-interest may look mighty, but they can shatter like glass when tested. And when they do, the world changes forever. The rise of new powers rarely announces itself with fanfare. It emerges quietly, then suddenly demands the world's attention. That night, while some nations were reeling from the shock of a collapsing order, others stepped forward, filling the empty space left behind. Power abhors a vacuum, and in that silence, new voices began to shape the conversation. What had once been a stage dominated by familiar actors now shifted, giving the spotlight to those long underestimated. These rising powers were not necessarily the wealthiest or the most militarized, but they had something more enduring: resilience, unity, and a sense of purpose. Their strength didn't come from traditional measures of dominance, but from the ability to adapt, to survive, and to offer alternatives when old systems failed. Suddenly, nations that had been overlooked or dismissed became central to shaping the future. Their influence spread not through force, but through vision and determination. For the old guard, it was unsettling. They had written the rules for decades, confident that their grip on power was unshakable. But as the cracks widened in old alliances, these emerging players showed that history is not bound to the past. They negotiated, they built, they reached out, forming bonds not of fear, but of shared goals. The balance shifted, slowly but undeniably, as the world began to recognize that new powers were not just filling space, but rewriting the rules themselves. The night made one truth impossible to ignore: power is not permanent. It flows, it shifts, and it rewards those who are willing to evolve when others cling to the past. And so, what began as the fall of the familiar became the dawn of the unexpected. The rise of powers that would shape the next chapter of history. When history remembers great shifts, it often speaks in terms of leaders, borders, or treaties. But beneath every decision lies a human cost. Lives altered, families torn apart, futures rewritten in silence. That night was no different. While leaders debated strategies and maps, ordinary people became the living testimony of what it means when power collides with reality. Cities that once glowed with life went dark, not from bombs or destruction, but from uncertainty. Parents held their children closer, unsure what tomorrow would bring. Soldiers stood at borders, not knowing if they would return home. And far away from the corridors of power, countless voices whispered the same question: why must history always demand a price from those with the least to give? The decision that altered history was made in silence, yet its echo was felt in the most fragile corners of human life. For every headline that spoke a strategy, there was a nameless face in the shadows paying the unseen toll. This was the paradox of power. It is often the powerless who feel its heaviest weight. And yet, within that suffering, there was also resilience. Communities came together, strangers shared what little they had, and hope stubbornly refused to die even in the darkest hours. The human cost was not just measured in loss, but in the way it revealed what truly matters when power fades: compassion, survival, and the will to endure. History may write of decisions and their global consequences, but it is the people who carry those decisions in their daily struggles, their sacrifices, and their courage. That night proved that no matter how powerful the decision, its true measure is found in the lives it touches. History has a way of repeating itself, not because people forget the events, but because they ignore the lessons. That night, when one decision altered the course of history forever, the greatest truth it left behind was not about power, politics, or military strength. It was about the fragility of human ambition and the permanence of human consequence. Decisions may be made in silence, behind closed doors, with a handful of leaders at the table. But the ripples of those choices spread outward endlessly, shaping the fate of millions who never had a say. The lesson history refuses to let us forget is simple: no decision exists in isolation. A single act can ignite wars, collapse economies, topple empires, or inspire revolutions. What may feel like a strategic move in the moment can become the burden of generations to come. Leaders may rise and fall, but the legacies of their choices live on in the people, the land, and the memory of nations. That night became a mirror, forcing the world to confront its own mistakes and patterns. It reminded humanity that history is not just about glory or power, but about responsibility. A decision made without foresight can destroy decades of progress, while a decision grounded in wisdom can protect centuries of peace. The world, shaken by that moment, realized that history is always watching and always teaching. And so the lesson etched into that night remains: clear power fades, empires fall, and wealth turns to dust. But the consequences of choices, whether reckless or righteous, endure forever. Those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. Those who listen may just alter its course for the better. That night was not just history. It was a warning written in fire. A single choice altered the path of nations, proving that destiny does not wait for armies, borders, or wealth. It waits for decisions. One act in silence can roar louder than 1,000 wars, and one moment of foresight or recklessness can define centuries to come. The world learned that night that power is fragile, alliances are temporary, but consequences are eternal. As the dust settled, leaders were left with a haunting truth. History is not shaped by the loudest voice or the strongest army, but by the weight of a single choice. The course of humanity can be redrawn not by weapons, but by decisions made in the stillness of a single night. And long after those leaders fade into memory, their choices live on, in the lives of people, in the maps of nations, and in the lessons of time. That night reminds us all we are never just witnesses to history. We are participants in it. Every decision, no matter how small, has the power to echo into forever.